Hello again, members. I'm Catherine McMacken, Membership Manager here at the Henry Ford. And as I hope you've heard, this weekend is the official season opening of Greenfield Village. I couldn't be more excited to get back into one of all of our favorite places again this year. So to get us in that village spirit before tomorrow's member preview day, I'm so happy to welcome you back for today's THF conversation for members. There's only one Greenfield Village. Our own curator of public life, Donna Braden, has spent decades researching and interpreting buildings in Greenfield Village, but it was only when she authored the Henry Ford's official guidebook that she truly realized how unique it is among museums and historical sites. So today, she joins us to reveal her top 10 favorite stories, little known facts, and interconnections from the village. Some serious and some humorous. So I know we're in for a really fun program. And it's so great to introduce you all to Donna. She's been a curator here at the Henry Ford for more than 4 decades. And of all of her work during that time, she considers her projects in Greenfield Village to be among her absolute favorites. So as we get started, I hope you'll take a moment to introduce yourself in the chat feature with your first name and where you're joining us from. We can kind of use this feature to see each other and our member community there. And while you enjoy the program, please do submit any questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end. And as always, to our members, thank you again for your ongoing support of the Henry Ford. We are so grateful that you continue to join us in our commitment to our mission as we activate new types of programming and bring back favorite experiences. So now I'm so happy to hand it over to Donna to take us behind the scenes at Greenfield Village.
All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome on this chilly, rainy afternoon. A good day to think about the village tomorrow and onward from there. I'm going to share my screen. I couldn't decide what picture to put on the front, so I put a bunch of pictures, both new and old, and that helps kind of define what Greenfield Village is all about. I'm going to start with a little bit of, I'd call it serious history before we get to my lighter top 10 topics, just in case some of you are a little bit less familiar with the village. So my first slide here is asking the question, what is Greenfield Village? A lot of people ask us about that. And often our first response is, well, it's not a village. But what exactly is it? One way to describe it is as Henry Ford's collection of buildings, representing his heroes, his personal history, and the crafts, industries, and homes that he felt represented both the way life had been in the past and a blueprint for people's lives in the present and future. We've continued to collect buildings that both reinforce these ideas and help us tell new stories. And I draw your attention to the slide here and a quote by Henry Ford back in the day that defined Greenfield Village for him and still in a lot of ways defines Greenfield Village today. He said, as a nation, we have not depended so much on the rare or occasional genius as on the general resourcefulness of our people. That is our true genius, and I'm hoping that Greenfield Village will serve that. And on the right, I show a 1951 map, a little bit after Henry Ford's time, but you can see how populated the village is at this point with buildings. It's kind of a fun, colorful map in our collection. Even though Henry Ford was collecting objects before this time, the genesis of what would become Greenfield Village started, I would say, in 1919. That year, Henry Ford learned that his birthplace was at risk because of a road construction project. So he took charge, moving the building, the farmhouse over a bit and restoring it to the way he remembered that it looked at the time of his mother's death in 1876 when he was 13 years old. He and his assistants combed the countryside for items that he remembered and insisted on tracking down and had to be in the building. So on its original site, you see the front parlor looking a lot like it, pretty much like it does today, with some of those objects that he tracked down, as well as the two slides on the right, which show the building as it appears in Greenfield Village today, the china in the china cabinet and the stove in the back parlor also, or in the dining room, the back parlor, I think, also based on his memories and what he felt needed to be tracked down to restore the building. And then he kind of got the restoring bug. He followed this up by restoring the one-room school he had attended as a boy, Scotch Settlement School, the Wayside Inn in South Sudbury, Massachusetts, and Botsford Inn, a stagecoach inn where he and his wife Clara had once attended old-fashioned dances. These restorations gave Ford many opportunities to add to his rapidly growing collection, as well as honing his ideas for his own historic village. For the historic village, actually Ford envisioned, for his museum and village in general, Ford actually envisioned two separate places. The museum would tell the story of man's technological progress through comprehensive displays, and then an outdoor village, shown here by the arrow, would show how these types of objects were made and used. In 1926, Ford scouted out sites for his planned museum and village, ultimately choosing a parcel of land that we know today, right in the middle of where he lived and worked. So if you look at this wonderful aerial view from 1930, and you can see the clock tower of the museum right in the center, the village is on the left, looking pretty sparse at this point. You can just make out where the arrow is the village green, and behind that, above that a little bit, is the Menlo Park complex, and behind that is just a lot of woods. Lovett Hall hasn't been built yet. In the front is the Ford Motor Company building and the ponds, two that are now one pond. And most interesting, I think, in the back is the Ford Airport, which opened in 1924 and was operating until 1947. And right across the street from that, across Oakwood Boulevard, would have been the next year, the Dearborn Inn, which was built in 1931. So by March of 1928, several buildings had already arrived. Sometimes Cutler, who was Henry Ford's draftsman, which he brought from Ford Motor Company, had only a few weeks to have a building completely dismantled, packed up, shipped to Dearborn, and rebuilt. I know my work on the Logan County Courthouse, that happened very quickly. A flurry of building, moving, and construction activity occurred in time for the October 21st, 1929 dedication of the museum and village, what was called Light's Golden Jubilee, which marked the 50th anniversary of Thomas Edison's invention of his workable incandescent electric lamp. And Ford continued to add buildings afterward, at times locating and relocating them to suit his purposes. Sometimes he even constructed whole new buildings, like the Martha Mary Chapel and Town Hall, shown here on the right. By the time of his passing in 1947, he had collected over 70 buildings, most of what still makes up the village today. And since that time, we've added a few buildings, including Heinz House in the 1950s, Dr. Howard's office, which was acquired in the 50s, but opened to the public in 1963. The Daggett Farmhouse, which at the time was called Saltbox House, acquired in 1977, and was being reconstructed with hand construction methods when I first started working, the first summer I started working at the museum that year. Also Firestone Farm in the 1980s, and the Roundhouse acquired in 2000. So that gives you a little background, and I will be mentioning a lot of these buildings again as I talk, but now I'm going to go to a little bit of a lighter focus, and which is the main focus of my talk today. A few years ago, I was tasked with writing the text for this new guidebook. to the Henry Ford. Back when I was working on that, I decided to start by writing about the village. That seemed fun and easy. And I would say it was fun, but it wasn't so easy. As I went through piles of materials I'd pulled together, trying to synthesize the essence of each building in about 200 words, which was about 3 paragraphs apiece, it truly struck me how unique and one of a kind the village is. So as a fun exercise during my writing breaks, I started asking myself, what were the most interesting kind of who knew things I was learning or relearning about Greenfield Village? And out of that exercise came this, what I call my top 10 countdown, stories, ideas, and interconnections. So keep in mind that there are so many more stories that could be told and remain to be told. So think of this as just a beginning. Number 10, how do we know stuff? Keep in mind, this is my list, my top 10. Not everybody would have a different one, but number 10, how do we know stuff? First of all, I realized pretty quickly that the writing I did on the village buildings for this guidebook over a period of about 3 months, just on the village, was only possible because of, thankfully, so much work that had been done on village buildings over the years, particularly the last, I would say, 3 decades or so, 3 or 4 decades. And I did some of that research, but many people contributed, and I was able to reap the benefits of all of our hard work. Most of this information, fortunately, ended up in written presenter manuals. That's a lot of times what our end product was in terms of to help train presenters and kind of review the background information about what they should talk about. So I was able to depend on those for so much of the information. With historical research, we can transform our buildings and stories from generic places like Elias Brown General Store or Clinton Inn to buildings from a specific time and place populated by people who actually lived and worked there, like J.R. Jones and Calvin Wood. Or we can transform and reinterpret a building that we thought was one thing into a building that was actually something else, like Mrs. Cohen's Millinery. To do our research, we sometimes use published books, but more often we're starting from scratch every single time we delve into a new building with primary sources like property deeds, probate records, census records, old maps, and newspaper articles. Here are some examples of how historical research has informed our thinking and led to current interpretations. For the Daggett farmhouse, we used Samuel Daggett's actual account book from the 1760s, helping break down the stereotype that families in northeastern Connecticut at the time were isolated and completely self-sufficient. We already knew that Daggett was a housewright, meant he built houses, as well as a farmer. From his account book, though, we find that he also dug stones for the local schoolhouse. He made shingles for other people's houses. He allowed his neighbors to use his oxen. He made chairs and spinning wheels, coffins and sleds, and even pulled teeth to earn extra income. One of the projects that we did was turn Clinton Inn into a 1850 historic restaurant called Eagle Tavern at the time. And one of the things that we did for that was to look at references to food and drink described by travelers in their published accounts as they traveled across southern Michigan in the mid-1800s. And I'll be talking a lot more about this in my talk in May that is exclusively about Eagle Tavern and the dining experience that we developed there. We often found references like this one from Charles Fenno Hoffman in 1833. The fare consisted of hot rolls and tea with large pieces of pork swimming in its gravy and a plate of noble potatoes that pulverized when you touched them. It's probably good that we didn't follow most of these to the letter, although the idea for strawberry shortcake that is often on the spring menu or early summer menu at Eagle Tavern did come from one of these references. And I'll also mention that the menu or the bill of fare on the left of the slide is our very first menu from 1982, which I dug out of my files when we were doing an Innovation Nation episode on Eagle Tavern. And again, I'll be talking more about the food and the creation of these menus at my talk in May. We have even used objects from our collections as research sources. For the general store, we reproduced product labels, and in fact, boxes and colors on boxes, by digitizing originals, then enhancing them to restore their original colors and fill in their missing pieces. Keep in mind that this was the early 1990s when we did this, and digitization was kind of a miracle technology. In fact, there was only one place in the entire area in Ann Arbor that digitized items, and so, or digitized paper labels. And so we packed up some of our items and took them there for them to work on. These are some examples of how we enhanced and digitized some of these labels. On the left, the original label that we had for Ayer's Hair Vigor, and on the right, how it was enhanced and used as a furnishing in the general store today. And on the right is a box. On the right-hand side of the right slide is the original box for holding bottles of extracts like vanilla, with the original label, and on the left, the recreated box with a digitally enhanced label that we used. So these are just a few examples of the research that has informed and will continue to inform our thinking as we uncover the stories of Greenfield Village buildings. In fact, a brand new installation you might want to check out when you go to the village this year, again, heavily based on primary sources, is the dining room at Webster House. And so you see, this is a never-ending process for us. Number 9, some of the most forgotten people in Greenfield Village, at least in my opinion. The kids. Kids show up virtually everywhere in the histories of Greenfield Village buildings. In addition to young Tom Edison at Smith's Creek Depot, as well as the well-known stories of Henry Ford, Harvey Firestone, and the Wright brothers in their boyhood homes, we have, and this is just a partial list and only from the period of our interpretation of these buildings, from the Daggett Farm in the 1760s, Asenath, Tabitha, and Isaiah. From the Webster home in the 1840s, we have daughter Louisa and granddaughter Mary, who lived with them, and another daughter and lots of grandchildren who came to visit often. At Eagle Tavern in 1850, we have Harriet Wood's daughters from a previous marriage, Irene and possibly Frances. We have several children from the Susquehanna plantation in 1860, as well as about 28 enslaved children. Dr. Howard had 4 children, Manchi, Maddie, Camer, and Letitia. And I love the fact that one of them, Manchi, actually became a doctor when he grew up. Sarah Jordan Boarding House, we do talk about her daughter Ida, who helped with the housekeeping. At Grimm Jewelry Store, there's 3 children from the 1880s. Mrs. Cohn's Millinery, you see one of the daughters here, Bessie, but there were also 3 other children. And then at Scotch Settlement School, we have several generations of children, beginning with Henry Ford schoolmates, and moving to the preschool that he established when he restored the building on its original site, and finally to the children who attended the Edison Institute schools in Greenfield Village starting in 1929. So my thought is, now that we have the regular guidebook done, maybe we should do a guidebook for children about the children, or from the children's point of view. Number 8, what I call big history. Many of our village buildings are here because of Henry Ford, his interests, his own history, his heroes. But sometimes those buildings also give us the opportunity to talk about what I call big history. That is, larger trends in American life, especially during the time of America's rapidly industrializing society of the late 1800s. Here are some examples. At this store, Engelbert Grimm sold modestly priced clocks, watches, and jewelry to Detroit area residents in the 1880s. One of his customers was Henry Ford, who often stopped by the store to purchase parts and chat with Grimm. But let's look at the larger history of this. In an increasingly urban and industrial nation, People were expected to know the time and be on time all the time. Notice if you follow the arrows that I drew here or inserted here, you can see that each of these photos from our Detroit Publishing Company collection has a public clock in it. The one on the left has a street clock. The one on the right has a clock in probably an office building. And the one below has a clock in the church steeple. Synchronizing one's watch with public clocks became part of meeting one's social responsibility. The clock and the watch came to be seen as models for disciplined, regulated personal behavior. One ad for pocket watches in the 1880s claimed, "The man is nothing but a botch who tries to live without a watch." The downside of this, of course, was a greater level of anxiety, living with what was called clock time, an artificial construct that was very different from following the natural rhythms of the sun, the moon, and the seasons, as farmers had done for centuries. Another example, Henry Ford brought Smith's Creek Depot here from near Port Huron because of its connection with young Thomas Edison. Let's look at the bigger history. The railroad depot was a hugely important center of small town life. More than the place to catch a train, it was here that townspeople sent and received packages and telegrams, awaited arriving travelers, and caught up on the latest news. Let's look again at photos from our great Detroit Publishing Company collection. Depots provided the link to the outside world. They brought excitement to small towns. To the young of many of these towns, they afforded whatever there might have been of dreams of escape, of hope for new possibilities. When the train came in, life moved faster with expectation and excitement. Young Tom Edison probably felt this when he went to work for the Grand Trunk Railway. And a final example, Henry Ford brought this building, Sarah Jordan's boarding house, here because of its connection with Edison. When Edison's Menlo Park lab was a going concern, more than a dozen of his unmarried male workers lived here at one time or another. This boarding house was also one of 3 private residences to be wired for Edison's new electrical lighting system in December 1879, and it's the only one still in existence. And that's pretty big and important history, but let's look at the broader significance of boarding houses at this time. During the 1800s, it has been estimated that over 70% of the population lived in boarding houses at some time in their lives. They were everywhere, in small towns and large cities, in new communities and old, in factory and mill towns, on fashionable boulevards and on unpaved back streets, excuse me. They existed in all degrees of luxury and sordidness and everything in between. The mushrooming of boarding houses at this time was particularly due to the shortage of affordable housing in the growing urban industrial centers, which were experiencing a tremendous influx of new wage laborers. The Sarah Jordan boarding house certainly fits within this context. Number 7, Henry Ford meets Luther Burbank. Henry Ford was inspired by World's Fairs, dating all the way back to his father's visit to the 1876 Philadelphia Centennial Exhibition when he was just a boy. In 1915, by now a famous automobile industrialist, Ford made a big splash at the Panama Pacific Exposition in San Francisco by displaying a working assembly line. It was in connection with this fair that he met Luther Burbank. Thomas Edison, Henry Ford, and a few other companions had traveled there in Ford's private rail car to enjoy the exposition's Edison Day on October 21st, 1915. Luther Burbank, living and working in nearby Santa Rosa, was asked by one of the exposition committees to meet the group in Sacramento, sort of an official welcome to California. Upon arriving at the fair, both Edison and Ford were swept up in a series of events celebrating Edison's achievements. Mutual friend and industrialist Harvey Firestone joined the two men in San Francisco and drove them around town. After that event, the group followed Burbank up on his invitation to visit him at his experimental garden in Santa Rosa. Edison and Ford particularly had a grand time. Burbank later wrote, "The ladies said we acted like three schoolboys, but we didn't care." An interesting side note, after that visit, the original travel group plus Harvey Firestone headed to San Diego's sister fair, the Panama, California exposition, for its Edison Day. In Riverside, south of Los Angeles, they ditched Henry's private rail car for much more fun and leisurely automobiles. The warm camaraderie that prevailed on that trip induced Edison to propose a camping trip for the next year for Ford, Firestone, and himself. The Vagabond camping trips were born. Here is a picture of Ford and Edison visiting Santa Rosa and visiting Burbank. Ford was so inspired by Luther Burbank's character, accomplishments, and learning by doing approach that in Greenfield Village, we have both a modified version of Burbank's birthplace and a restored version of his garden office from Santa Rosa, as well as Burbank's shovel stuck into the concrete in a cornerstone now inside the museum. Number 6, other World's Fair connections. So speaking of World's Fairs, the village has a few direct connections to World's Fairs of the 1930s. First, Ford Motor Company's exhibit became the exhibit of 1934, revitalizing the flagging attendance of Chicago's Century of Progress exposition that had initially opened the previous year. In a striking Albert Kahn designed exposition building, which of course many of you know, part of which became the Ford Rotunda in Dearborn after the fair, Ford boasted the largest and most expensive corporate pavilion that year. It covered 11 acres and drew more than 75% of all visitors to the fair that year. So note in the upper left on the floor plan on the right, behind the Ford Century room, and if you can't read it, I'll read it for you. There's a space called the Henry Ford Century room, which included the quadricycle and some early vehicles, and past what was called the soybean field and a series of traction engines, there was an exhibit called the Industrialized Barn. This exhibit was staged in what was referred to as a weathered outbuilding from the Ford family homestead. It was, in fact, the William Ford barn, now in Greenfield Village. The exhibits there reflected Henry Ford's interest in combining agriculture and industry, especially soybean production and use. The barn included equipment for extracting soybean oil, making plastic objects of soybean meal, and a general utility machine shop. There, visitors could touch plastic gear shift knobs, horn buttons, and light switches made of soybean. Henry Ford relentlessly promoted the industrial uses of soybean at all 6 World's Fairs held in the United States during the 1930s. At the Texas Centennial Exposition of 1936, this model soybean extractor was demonstrated. This imposing object is now prominently displayed in the Soybean Lab Agricultural Gallery in Greenfield Village. And at the 1939 New York World's Fair, not only were the company's products and Henry's passion for soybeans featured in the Ford Exposition building, but Henry Ford also wanted to show off his experimental school system from Greenfield Village. As you can see, featured in the Herald article that was a magazine done by and for school students of the Edison Institute schools on the right. In a 1/3 scale of Edison's Menlo Park machine shop in Greenfield Village, 5th and 6th grade students made model machine parts and demonstrated the use of the machines and instruments. This demonstration also gave Ford the opportunity to highlight the achievements of his hero, Thomas Edison. The shop was called A Working and Living Memorial to the Great Genius Who Once Worked on the Original. Number 5, buildings with many lives. When we choose a time and place on which to focus each village building, we inevitably leave out some choices. Usually left unsaid are all those other stories that we decide not to interpret. Here are 2 buildings in Greenfield Village that had particularly fascinating lives. From Detroit City directories, we learned that this building was unfortunately not the McGill jewelry shop that Henry Ford thought he brought here. After considering several options, Mrs. Cohen's millinery shop from the mid-1890s was chosen as the focus for the building. But it had many other lives in its past, and what were some of those other options that we could have chosen to interpret? Before Mrs. Cohen ran her millinery business in this building, it was a fancy goods store selling items like ladies' fans, hair combs, and gloves, a grocery, a dry goods store selling sewing notions, fabric, thread, things like that, and a flour and feed store. And after Mrs. Cohen ran her shop there, the building became a tavern or saloon, then a dry cleaning and dyeing, DYE, establishment, a confectionery, a Kroger grocery and baking company, a family grocery store, and finally, as you see in this last photo, group of photos before it moved to the village, a restaurant. Another example, Logan County Courthouse. We know that this building was the Logan County Courthouse. It was built as a courthouse in 1840 in Postville, Illinois. And we know, of course, that this is where Abraham Lincoln practiced law as a circuit riding lawyer. But for more than 80 years, between 1847 and 1929, when it was brought to Greenfield Village, it had many other lives. From 1848 to at least the 1860s, it was a dry goods and grocery store, and probably also served as the local post office. But by the 1880s, and up until the time Henry Ford acquired it, it was a private residence. In the 1880s, the family of George Sanders lived here. By 1903, a front porch had been added, and Mr. and Mrs. John Scoof lived there with their daughter and 7 sons. From about 1910 to 1913, the John and Ruby Kirk family lived there. Here's a wedding photo of the two of them. In 1913, Judge Timothy T. Beach, a Civil War Union veteran, and his wife Grace purchased the building. Judge Beach seems to have been the first to truly appreciate the historic significance of the building. He tried for the next 15 years to convince the town and groups in the town to preserve it. He tried the local chapter of the DAR, who ended up putting up a boulder with a plaque on the grounds. You can still see that today. The state of Illinois he talked to the local American Legion post, but they all felt that they couldn't afford the cost of restoring the now rundown building. During this time, he seems to have rented the building to private residents for a while, but by the 1920s, he was providing the building rent-free to caretakers, including by 1921, a Mr. and Mrs. Stewart Roberts and their family, who were an African-American family. And by 1925, up until Henry Ford acquired the building, Mr. and Mrs. Elijah Watkins, shown here with their grandchildren. And also very interesting interior shots of the courthouse looking or furnished as a home, a living space for Mr. and Mrs. Watkins. The many lives of the courthouse are not over. In 1953, the state of Illinois decided to construct a replica of the courthouse on its original property where it had been located. So if you drive down historic Route 66 today, like we did several years ago, through Illinois, you pass this courthouse. It's right along the road, and you kind of do a double take if you know the courthouse in Greenfield Village, because it looks not exactly, but pretty much like it. And it's just interesting to kind of follow buildings that are now in Greenfield Village and see what happens to the original sites that they came from. Is kind of an interesting solution that they came up with. Number 4, an innovation once, but I would say not anymore by the time I talk about this story. Many of you are familiar with the story of Henry Ford and the Model T, how it was such a great thing that Henry Ford stuck with it and stuck with it. and stuck with it until he stuck with it too long and probably would have put his company at risk if he hadn't changed with the times to the Model A in 1927. Farmers in East Central Ohio, like Harvey Firestone's father Benjamin, have a similar story to tell. In 1810, thousands of merino sheep were imported directly from Spain to Vermont. Merinos were characterized by a heavy, wrinkly hide with an abundant and dense fleece, suitable for producing the finest grade of wool in the world. By the 1820s and 1830s, their offspring formed the foundation of what would become known as the Ohio fine wool region. Farmers in that area realized huge profits from raising purebred merino sheep. That's when Peter Firestone, Benjamin's father and Harvey's grandfather, built the farmhouse and barn that we have in Greenfield Village today, devoting a whopping 35% of the stall area to those merino sheep. Despite some good years after that, by the 1880s, the time of our interpretation, competition from wool growers out west, as well as in Argentina, Australia, and South Africa, were dramatically cutting into Eastern Ohio farmers' profits. Like other farmers in the area, Benjamin cut back considerably on the number of sheep he raised compared to his father. He raised about 130 in 1880 versus about 287 back in 1850. But it was hard for these farmers to respond quickly and effectively to the competition. For generations, they had directed their efforts to producing fine wool from merino sheep. Most of them were dependent on merino wool as their main source of income. And they would soon face a financial crisis, forcing them to slowly diversify to mixed crops and beef or dairy cattle. And this is in fact what happened at the Firestone farm. It's kind of shocking to see so many cattle in the barnyard in that slide on the left. The story of the merino sheep and the Ohio fine wool region is a great example of the historical research that we do. Peter Cousins, our curator of agriculture at the time the farmhouse was moved here, depended heavily on the agricultural census to uncover this story. Number 3, who knew that was an innovation? The perception that many people have of carousel animals is that they were hand carved by lone wood carvers in little shops, like German immigrant Gustav Denzel, shown here on the left, kind of like Geppetto carving Pinocchio. But this was not the case with the Herschel Spillman Company of North Tonawanda, New York, the makers of our carousel. This company epitomized the innovative manufacturing techniques of American carousel builders during the early 1900s. They actually specialized in high quality engines, machinery, and boilers, so they knew how to create dependable mechanisms to run carousels. And they decided to produce quantities of affordable carousel animals through a shop production method and system that used carving machines to rough out the shapes and dozens of semi-skilled and unskilled workers to finish the work. This company would become one of the most popular and successful manufacturers of carousels in the country. Their shop production methods kept costs down and made the carousels affordable and appealing to owners of city parks, amusement parks, and resorts, like the Lake Resort located near Spokane, Washington, where our carousel came from. Number 2, an innovator we should relish. I'm talking, of course, about Henry J. Heinz. Why do I put him so high in my top 10 list? Because he wasn't just an inventor or an entrepreneur or a marketing genius. He was all of these things, and I'm not sure we appreciate that enough. Through the course of his career, he truly changed the way we eat and the way we think about what we eat. To me, this makes him one of the best examples of an innovator, right up there with Henry Ford and Thomas Edison. Let's talk a bit more about this. In Greenfield Village, we have the home where Henry J. Heinz started out, peddling produce from his family's garden, then selling bottled horseradish. He started his company in 1859 out of his home when he was just 25 years old. From horseradish, Heinz branched out to bottling many other products, always stressing that these were pure and high quality at a time when lots of other processed foods were not. In fact, he was instrumental in the passage of the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act, which prohibited the rampant use of sometimes dangerous, even toxic food additives. Before the days of refrigeration, his condiments and relishes helped ease some of the onerous canning and preserving of work of housewives, added flavor to people's monotonous diet, and helped make less than fresh food taste more palatable. Heinz had an eye for promotion and advertising unequaled among his competitors. In the upper left, you see this giant electric sign that was in New York City. The Heinz Pier, he added a big building featuring Heinz products in Atlantic City, which opened in 1898. A Heinz company delivery wagon with plastered with advertising, and a streetcar ad that would have been inside a streetcar, much like the signs inside buses and subways later. The free pickle pin giveaway was perhaps his most genius idea. Heinz first got the idea of offering a free pickle-shaped giveaway at the World's Columbian Exposition in 1893 to attract visitors to his exhibit that was languishing on the second floor of the agricultural building. The first giveaway was not a pin, but what was called a watch fob. It had an eye-shaped hook to hang from a man's pocket watch, much like the one you see in the photo. At some point in the early years of the 20th century, these watch fobs were redesigned as pins so anybody could wear them. Since then, the pickle pin has been considered one of the most successful advertising promotions in American history. By the time of H.J. Heinz's death in 1919, his company had grown into one of the largest food processing businesses in the nation. His company was known not only for innovative food processing, packaging, and advertising, but also enlightened business practices and company policies towards employees. So the next time you pass the Heinz House in Greenfield Village, stop in and catch up on the achievements and innovations of H.J. Heinz. And number one, shaped by a place. As I was reviewing and learning anew about some of the stories in Greenfield Village, it struck me how strongly a place can shape and influence a person's life. Not only do these serve as lessons about the power of place to inspire in their own time, but these places and the stories connected with them can still inspire us today. Furthermore, I believe that these encourage us to think about the places in our own lives that have influenced and inspired us and helped shape who we are. Here are a few examples. While his primary law practice was in the state capital of Springfield, Illinois, Abraham Lincoln also traveled to other courthouses in the region to try cases on what was called the 8th Judicial Circuit. And as I mentioned before, from 1840 to 1847, one of these was the courthouse in Postville, Illinois, that's now in Greenfield Village. Abe Lincoln thrived as a traveling lawyer on the circuit, handling all kinds of cases, representing different types of people, and getting to know local residents. Lincoln developed an extraordinary ability to listen, understand, and even represent opposing viewpoints. All of these experiences in courthouses, including the one that we have in Greenfield Village, helped prepare him for his future role as America's 16th president. When the Grand Trunk Railway extension was completed, enterprising young Tom Edison took a job with the railway as a newsboy. He also sold candy and fresh produce on the train and at depots along the route, like Smith's Creek, where shown here in Greenfield Village. He put other boys to work as well, claiming a share of the profits. He tried his hand at other things while working for the railway, telegraphy, printing, and experimenting with chemicals. Unfortunately, when his chemical experiments set a baggage car on fire alongside this depot, his work on the railway was through. But all of these experiences helped shape who Edison would become: enterprising, curious, entrepreneurial, including others in his plans, and understanding the advantages of using emerging technologies. Henry Ford was born and raised in this farmhouse, now in Greenfield Village, the eldest of William and Mary Ford's 6 children. Henry hated the drudgery of farm work. He often felt that there had to be ways to make work easier for farmers. Influenced by these experiences, he spent his entire life trying to ease the burdens of farmers and make their lives easier. Of course, his most famous example was the Model T. Other examples included his tractors, experimenting with soybeans as an agricultural product that could be used in industry, and creating the small-scale, decentralized village industries. And I don't know if you can see it that well, but in the upper right is a humorous postcard that shows a Model T being strapped for the motor to be used, the power to be used to run a washing machine, a baby's cradle, and a butter churn on a farm. Talk about easing farmers' burdens. And finally, for Wilbur and Orville Wright, the home in Dayton, Ohio, now in Greenfield Village, was the setting of so much of the family's life. It was modest in size and appearance. It had no electricity or running water or plumbing until the brothers were in their 20s. And in fact, the brothers themselves helped make many of the improvements on the house as they got older. The one thing, though, that was substantial was the family's book collection. As their father, Bishop Wright, championed reading. Orville later said, "The greatest thing in our favor was growing up in a family where there was always encouragement to intellectual curiosity." Home and family life were so influential in shaping the brothers' character, values, and ability to achieve their dream of human flight that Wilbur later remarked to a young man who asked him that the way to get ahead in life was to pick out a good father and mother and begin life in Ohio. So these are the things that give me shivers when I read and write about the village or go out there and remind myself what an awesome place it is. So I encourage you to go out to the village and reflect on these stories and find some new stories as you're out there. And remember, as odd and anachronistic as the village seems at times, the juxtaposed time periods, the buildings from so many different places, and the people, the variety of people highlighted there, there's only one Greenfield Village. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Donna, for this just totally delightful and fun program. There's so many great stories from Greenfield Village, and I know so many of us can't wait for that first trip back this season. So that's a great reminder. We'll have our special members only preview tomorrow, April 16. So I hope everyone has made their reservations and that I'll be seeing you all there. Now we have time for a few questions. Some have come in already, so we'll start with those as more are submitted through the Q&A tool. Let's start with, how long did it take you to write the guidebook?
It seemed like a flurry of activity right from the beginning. I think it took about 2 years altogether. And actually it took a few months just to rough out an outline and have everyone approve it. And picking which village buildings and which objects in the museum was actually kind of a challenge. But we finally got to a point where everybody agreed. And then it never seemed like there was enough time to work on any of it. But I think altogether with the editing, it took about 2 years.
Wow. Yeah, it's such a huge task to boil the Henry Ford down to one book.
Right.
We're so grateful that you did.
Yeah, it's good that there was so much material already available, and that I also had worked on a lot of these things, or I knew who to ask. That was a really important point.
Absolutely. The next question is actually about a building that is not in Greenfield Village. Jeff asks, I understand the Ulysses S. Grant House was offered to the Henry Ford, but the Henry Ford did not acquire it. Instead, it was moved to the old fairgrounds, to the Eastern Market, maybe one of those locations. So the question then is, do you know why the Henry Ford did not acquire a building like that?
I'm sorry, I have never heard that story. So that is definitely worth following up on and finding out more about.
Absolutely. Always
Thank
more
you.
to research, right?
Always more to research, right?
Absolutely. The next question is actually a request back into your presentation to see a close-up view of the 1951 village map.
Yeah.
Are you able to zoom in and show that off a little bit?
Let me see if I can do that because it is a really great map. So let's go back to that and see if I can enlarge that. Let's see. I don't know what you want to see, but I love, first of all, at the top, let's see, the pictures of Henry Ford and Thomas Edison and all the little iconic scenes in it. And then as we work our way down, here we go. There's a little key to it. I don't know if there's something specifically that you want to see. Let's see.
Even the illustrations are so great.
They are. It's beautifully illustrated. And then I also got a kick out of, as I was looking at this last night, who they decided to draw at the bottom. And it looks to me like it's with their little iconic items here. It looks like certainly Abraham Lincoln. It looks like Burbank, maybe with the fruit, the Wright. They're not real good likenesses in some cases, but the Wright brothers, and then looks like Stephen Foster, maybe, or McGuffey. No, I bet it's McGuffey. Anyway, here's a really nice sign here. Greenfield Village, an outdoor museum dedicated to his friend Thomas A. Edison by Henry Ford. October, does that say 1921st, 1950, I guess. Dearborn, Michigan. But back to the scene. Here's an overview again.
It's a beautiful piece about a beautiful place, right?
It is, and there are many maps that I could have shown, and I just loved this one when I saw it. There's even the river back there, the Swanee steamboat, and you know, I know a few things have been moved since then. It'd be interesting to kind of look at this closer, but you could probably find this on our digital collections. That's where I found it. So if you look up the Henry Ford digital collections or the Henry Ford collections and research and do search collections, if you type in 1951 map of Greenfield Village, you should be able to find it.
Oh, good tip.
Look at it at your leisure.
Excellent.
Okay.
Our next question comes from Rob, and he asks, is Greenfield Village still referred to as the Edison Institute the way it's engraved on the front gate?
In my years working at the Henry Ford, we've gone through many names. And I know Harold Scramstead, who was our president from the 1980s to the mid 90s, tried to revive that name and have us be called the Edison Institute again. And it didn't work that well because people thought we were a university. They confused the kind of connotation of the word institute has changed a lot. But I know that it was still our corporate name. And so on our checks, it would still say the Edison Institute. I'm not sure if it still is or not, but it was the incorporated name. And I know for years through which I worked, it was still, even if we changed our name many times for the public, but the Edison Institute remained kind of the corporate name.
Thank you. Next question is about, again, another building it looks like is not in the village. Has the Henry Ford ever tried to acquire Nankin Mills in Westland, Michigan?
That's a beautiful place. I don't know. I've never heard that we did. I know that there are several Village Industries buildings. That's a Village Industries building that have remained on their original sites, and maybe, I don't know who owned and operated them, but it's interesting. I've never heard of any of the Village Industries buildings, an attempt to bring them here. And maybe there's a reason for that, but that's a good question, and a really beautiful building and site. It's kind of cool that you can leave, our museum and village and go out into the area and see number of sites that are kind of interconnected with this history.
Oh, absolutely, across the whole area. And our next question is from Carl. And he especially thanks you for today's presentation. And then he says, speaking of how the village can be anachronistic, can you speak about the importance of the plantation in the scheme of the village?
Well, there's, Henry Ford's original vision was to represent historic structures from the north, from different regions along the East Coast, so the north and the south. Usually we have found that the histories of these buildings that he brought were a little different than what he thought. But we have, in the last couple of decades, we've done a lot more in-depth research about that building to try to get at kind of the most accurate history that we can get at. And so we have a pretty good profile of that. And we worked with local historians in that area as well, in Maryland, and try to do as accurate a history as we can. We've also added dramatic presentations to help, sometimes in our buildings, I found this in the general store, 5,000 objects I worked on to refurnish that building, but they're still just objects in the end. And to really get at the human factor, sometimes it really helps to bring in these dramatic presentations that help you understand the kind of the emotions, the contested nature, the good things, the bad things between people, which is really what happened and what happens today. So the dramatic presentations help bring a human element to the building and kind of all of the stories that were going on in, with the plantation owners and the enslaved people. And I love the fact that we've also added a dramatic performance to our holiday nights program in that building in the kitchen, which is just fantastic. I know it was a little bit disconcerting to see a white presenter cooking in that space. And now to have African-American actress really paint a picture so much better of what life was like in that building. I think that's just been a wonderful addition to that program.
Absolutely.
We continue to research and try to get at the best, most accurate stories behind each of our buildings. It's an ongoing process. It's like juggling. There are so many buildings and so many things we could do. The Webster dining room that I mentioned took a year, 2 years to do one room, to work on one room. So, they take a while.
And so thorough.
We try. I mean, that's our work.
Absolutely. Our next question is, what activities, if any, took place at Greenfield Village during the Great Depression and during World War II?
What activities? Well, I do know that Henry Ford did not necessarily want people off the street to come in the village when he first built it. He actually wanted it to serve as a school for school children. And so the village was not open to the public until 1933, opened in 1929, but it was mostly just for his school. And people were pounding on the doors to see it. So finally in 1933, he opened it up to the public, but then it sounds like he still kind of controlled it. So I think visitors were allowed to walk in, but they had to board a horse and carriage at what was Clinton Inn to take a carriage ride around where the historic houses were. He didn't want people just wandering around there. And it was very controlled. So I think it was pretty staid as far as activities during that time. And it was really after Henry Ford's era that they started bringing in events like Old Car Festival and the Muzzle Loaders Festival. Some of you may remember that, which was a sort of Civil War era reenacting, and Country Fair. Some of these were based on the kinds of activities that the students did, but kind of opening it up to the public really got going in the 1950s.
Excellent, thank you. Our next question is actually also going to be our last because we're very close to our time today. So many people have asked in the chat feature and in the Q&A feature, Donna, what is your favorite building or project in Greenfield Village?
Sometimes I'll say whatever I'm working on at the time, but in my career, I would say that my all-time favorite building to work on was the general store. And that was about 4 years of my life in the 1990s. And partly it was 4 years because we could never put together enough of a budget to actually spend the money to redo all of it because it was so big. So I got to do more research and I got to, work with the collection some more. But I think the reason I liked it the most was because it was this wonderful combination of local history, lots and lots of objects, an interpretive program, the dramatic program, how to recreate reproductions. It was so big. I love big projects. There were so many things interconnected in it that we were always trying to kind of combine together to, see how it worked out. I loved the full kind of the big nature of working on it. And it was truly a labor of love. And then just seeing after years of imagining what the building would look like, because if some of you saw it in the 1980s or earlier, it looked like the usual general store in a historic village, which was kind of like an antique shop. Everything looked old, and there were a lot of like one of a kind things. But I realized early on, and looking at photos and everything, to really look like really recreate a working store, we would have to everything would have to look new, and there would have to be a lot of the same thing, like quantities of the same thing. Once I had that in my mind, all I could do was imagine it and try to figure out how to make it happen until the couple weeks before it opened, when we actually did it and put it on the shelves. And it was just like this magical transformation to me when I could actually, set that up. And of course, so many people helped with it. I did not do this myself, but I was the one that kind of always had it in my mind how it might look. And then, last year, because of an Innovation Nation episode that I was asked to do, I revisited the little Dr. Howard's building because I wanted to go back and make sure, again, check the history and try to make it as accurate as we could. And that set me off on like a 4-month research project, which is still not done, of what is the real story behind that building, the community, the neighborhood, the Native American connection. And that became my labor of love. So, it was like, who knew after all these years there'd be a building that could so become such a great research project. When you think everything's done, there's so many things still to do. And that's what keeps it interesting, I think.
Oh, that's super cool. Sometimes I think that's almost like one of the extra themes of our series of programs for members, is that there's always more to research.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, thank you for this program. Thank you again, Donna. Thank you to everyone joining us for the program today. You all know we love to share our passion for history and for the Henry Ford with our members. And we're always so grateful that you continue to connect with us in virtual programs like today. We did have some questions about our next virtual program. So like I always say, if you enjoyed today's virtual program, join us again. Next month, we'll have a THF conversation for members where we'll be welcoming Donna back to share some of the background story about the food and menus at one of our village favorites, Eagle Tavern. Because we'll be getting ready to reopen the tavern to members first during Member Appreciation Days in May. And you can always find the schedule with the upcoming topics at thf.org, and of course when you subscribe to our emails. But as we wrap up today, thank you again to all of our members for all that you do to support the Henry Ford. And I really hope to see you next time.